Bank of England's Ramsden steps up and drops these comments. Now again, you can see that they don't always tell everything outright, but they give you the right clues to know what's going on. Ramsden here is basically playing the confidence card, saying inflation is on track to drop to the Bank of England's target, and their confidence on that is much higher than before. That's the central bank's way to say our next move is a rate cut. Get ready for it. So the vibe there is obviously dovish. They're getting ready to cut rates. And what that means for the domestic currency, bearish. So the pound at that point needs to start pricing in that upcoming interest rate cut in advance. And to do that, it needs to weaken. So where is EURGBP headed next? Up it is. And it did so right up until that 25 basis point cut from the Bank of England was fully priced in. The market got the message, it understood the forward guidance, and so it priced in that interest rate change in advance. That led the pound to weaken.